Hello, my name's Eric and this is Eric's Electronics, and today we're going to begin a project. I don't know how long this is going to take us, but we're going to take a project and go through it, an electronics project, and explain something. So it isn't just going to be about restoration, but it will also be a tutorial on basic electronics, especially electronics based on older technology, what's now being called classic or boat anchor technology, because we're going to be doing a lot of work with tube-oriented things. Now, tubes are really fun for guys like me who learned electronics using tubes, but for younger generations, they don't know what it's about and they feel a certain mystery about. Once you understand tubes, you understand a lot about how electronics works. This is going to be part of our journey together. So what we're going to do is we're going to start with this particular project. This is very personal to me. This is the kitchen radio from my childhood, and I've retained it for all these years, and thinking that someday I'd be able to actually know enough and learn enough to restore it, and that's the idea. So this is my kitchen radio, and so part of this, I'm not particularly concerned about whether I get 1 million views on this or not, but this is really kind of a memorial for my family to understand why it is that I would choose to spend so much time and sentiment on this particular piece of old technology. So what we're going to do is we're going to try and take this old radio, which I've been in a couple of times over the last several decades, and see what we can do to maybe bring it back to its former glory. And so that's the intent. So let me tell you a little bit about the project here. This is a Packard Bell Model 501 AM receiving radio. And this particular radio is of a type. Back in the mid-50s, manufacturers, consumer electronics manufacturers began to churn out lots of great little products. And one of the standard products was what was called or came to be known as the All-American 5. Many manufacturers would create these All-American 5 AM radios. And this is very, from my understanding, this is a great example of an All-American 5. It was American made, and there were 5 vacuum tubes in it. We'll get into that a little bit, but that's what was going on here. I'm going to show you that this is a very simple thing. It plugs in with a old style non-polarized plug, and we'll talk about polarization later on. Just plugs into the wall, and there are 3 knobs, 3 controls on the radio. The first is obviously the tuning dial here. You can see it will sweep back and forth, and then we have the on-off volume knob here, and then there's an outer ring which controlled the tone of the sound, bass, treble. It was very simple, and that's all there was to it. When you would want to listen to the radio, you turn it on. It would take about 15 seconds to warm up, and then a typical AM signal would come out. If you wanted a particular station, this particular radio had the dial what was called stationized, and you can see that here on the label. Stationized, Packard Bell stationized. And so if my dad was waking up in the morning and he wanted to know about traffic and just kind of news of the world, he'd tune this to the particular news station here. This particular template is oriented toward the western United States, Southern California in particular, where we grew up. So he would turn to KNX news radio over here. And then he would turn off the radio, he'd be ready to go to work, and then my mom would wake up and she'd maybe want to listen to some maybe some talk radio. So she'd turn it over here to KFI, way over here. And then my sister and I would come home from school and we'd want to listen to the top 40, what my dad would have called teeny bopper music. And so we would turn it over to KHJ, which was, and listen to the real Don Steele tell us what kind of music we really should like. This is all very big, and if you were in the Southern California radio scene in the late 60s and 70s, you would just understand everything I just said. So that was the idea, is that you would actually turn to the station, the area on the dial, and then when you got close to that, then you would maybe tweak it a little bit just to improve the reception just a tad. And then we'll try to discuss how that works and what the components are actually doing inside here in a general way. You know, there are a lot of people who do these kind of videos, and they truly are experts, certified radio engineers, just really, really great. But it seems to me that there's a place for somebody like me to talk to somebody like you. You're not particularly an engineer, though you might be interested in electronics. You're just kind of curious, perhaps. And so I'm going to be doing a lot of explaining of just basic electronics to help you understand what's actually going on. And the likelihood is that once we go through this whole radio and explain it and go through the restoration, kind of explain how it sort of works in its major components, you'll learn a lot about electronics that maybe you just didn't even know before. And as we go along, you'll learn some techniques about proper bench technique. You'll see I have kind of a workbench here that I'm working on, and how to actually work. We'll probably, I'm not sure yet, but we'll probably get the soldering iron out. We'll probably use a tube tester, and we'll definitely be fidgeting and playing with the radio. So that's what we're going to be doing, and that's what I'm hoping we're going to be able to accomplish, is to just, this will be more of an education for you, and so that you can learn a little bit more about how things used to work and maybe how things work today. So without a lot of more further ado, as they say, let's get into the radio and take a look at what's going on. Now the radio, as you see here, is again, as we discussed, it was very simple. And this case, which kind of is this beautiful dark brown, this looks like plastic. It actually is not plastic. It's kind of a pre-plastic. The radio was manufactured, we think, in 1954. And so this was before plastics became widely used and inexpensive. So what they used was this material that they called Bakelite. Bakelite was kind of a plastic sort of material, and it acted as an insulator. And so you see this is made out of Bakelite here. It was easily molded, it insulated from electricity. These knobs here, the two knobs here and here, these I believe are straight up plastic, but the case is not. When you turn the case around, the radio around, we see here that you can kind of see here inside there are some components which we'll discuss later on. There's the cord which comes in here, it's kind of tied off here. There's a little piece of metal. You'll notice that most of the metal is covered up except for that little band here. This little thing is an RCA plug that would allow for an external speaker if you wanted to do that. This clip allowed for an external antenna to help improve reception. You see these kind of wires here. We'll describe what those are about later on. All right, I'm going to beg your pardon for kind of the weird camera angle here, but I wanted to show you the back of this. As I pointed out, it's very faded in the back, and you can see here in red, model 501, and it gives you the specifications: volts 110 to 120 AC/DC, 28 watts, cycles 50 to 60 cycles. Talks about it being made in the USA, Packard Bell, Los Angeles, California, which is kind of cool for me because I'm a California boy. Talks about servicing screws, removing mounting screws. We'll actually do that a little bit. Instructions. It talks about the antenna that you can use here and how it's wonderful. And then over here is the tube layout. So back in the day, they would actually show you the tubes, the tube numbers, and where they were laid out. And we'll see that as we open up the radio later. Here's a 12 AT6, 12 BE6, 12 BA6, a 50 C5, and a 35 W4. These numbers and letters had meaning, as you can imagine. The first number and the last number had specific meanings in terms of the structure of the particular tube, and then the middle number, middle letters would be the kind of manufacturer's description of what the tube did functionally in terms of its electronic value. So that's kind of the deal. Now you'll also notice here that the, as I mentioned, there's this kind of cardboard backing here, and then this very thin strip of metal that is visible here, and that's purposely. We want to lessen the amount of metal visible and touchable, which we'll get into. And so, like I said, I've been in this radio several times, and so I kind of know how to get into it. And so we'll just go walk you through that. I'm not turning the radio on right now. There's a reason for that, because I don't know the condition of the radio, it actually could be unsafe, and we'll describe why that should be the case, and also that will explain why we only see this little piece of metal here down at the bottom. It's because it's possible that you could get shocked by touching that piece of metal. So we're not going to energize this until we look at the interior of the radio and make sure that it's safe, and check it out just generally. Okay, so with that in mind, I'm going to turn this over gently on the back, and you'll see that it's held to the chassis. That's the metal part that we saw inside by these two screws. We'll remove the screws and take the chassis out. We'll also, to get the guts out, we'll have to take off the two knobs here, which are very easy, and this tuning knob. And so we'll do that in just a minute. So as we're going to get the radio off, we're going to take the knobs off, and that's very easy. They just pull right off. They're just press fit. Same thing for one. Take that off, and then the tuning knob just pulls off. Just that easy. Now, good bench practice. Whenever you take parts out, you probably should store them someplace safe so that they don't knock off on the floor, they don't get damaged. So I'm going to take these knobs and just put them into this little plastic case. I'm going to close up the case, place it over here a little bit out of harm's way so that I don't knock it over or anything like that. So now the next step is to unscrew the radio from the case. So down here you can see the two screws. I'm just going to use this electric screwdriver. And out it comes. Easy. Same thing here. Now, of course, now that I have two parts, I'm going to put those parts back in with my little tray just to keep them safe so that they don't get lost. It's a lot easier to keep track of one big container like this than a lot of little parts floating around on your bench. All right. So now that we're here, now we're in the moment of truth here. We're going to pull this out very gently. Now we have the case. The case is now separate, and you can kind of see inside the case here. So that's the case. Put that over to the side. Now we're going to look at the radio. So from the front, there we are. Now, a couple of years ago, as I was getting into the radio, I realized that the old radio had a speaker. It was made out of paper, and the paper had deteriorated over the years. It was actually now just it was actually falling apart. So I had ordered a speaker, and I soldered that back in place here, and so the speaker is new. So you can kind of see it looks new. But everything else is pretty much, I don't think I've messed with this at all in any way. We have this little light, which is a dial light. It would illuminate the dial down here. We'll get to that. You can see the vacuum tubes here. 1, 2, 3, 4, and then 5 here in the shadow. All American 5. You'll see here the tuning capacitor. That's this thing here, which helps bring in the stations, okay, as you're tuning the stations. You can see there's some dirt here, which we'll probably need to clean off at some point. We're going to turn this over now and take a look at what's going on. As we turn it over, look underneath, and we see, well, it's quite an interesting arrangement here. What we see here are a bunch of components that are soldered together, point to point, and it really looks like quite a mess. I mean, it does. It just looks like a mess. Now, another thing I'm seeing here is that there are, I mean, I can identify many of these components. There's actually just some dirt here that's just coming here. This is going to be a capacitor. These are capacitors. This is a combination capacitor. There's another capacitor. These little browns with the brown cylinders with the colors on them. These are resistors. This is the volume knob here. There are some coils here, tuning coils, which help tune in the radio. So there's a lot of stuff here. Now I can tell already that not only was this kind of cheaply made, as you can kind of see, it's just kind of components just placed in here and just soldered in place. But in addition, this is very old. Now, one of the things that's going to happen with a really old radio like this, and I'll just use a little screwdriver to kind of point at it. Notice that we're not plugged in at all, so this is pretty safe. And this hasn't been plugged in for a long time, so there's no real, ought not to be any real danger here in just using the screwdriver. You know something? Let me do this. This is not right. I'm supposed to be showing you good practice. Let me not point out things with a metal screwdriver. Let me get something that's really right, okay? Hold on. All right, back with you now. What I have here is a plastic screwdriver, which actually we may use at some point. I'm not sure, but it's possible you could use this at some point on the radio. But it's plastic, it's not going to conduct electricity, and it's just a lot safer to do. I feel kind of embarrassed that I just went ahead and did that. That's a rookie mistake. I shouldn't really do that. But anyway, so here we go. We have these capacitors, and I look at them, they're all dipped in wax. You can see, I don't know if you can see where I could just scrape that off with my finger, and some of that wax is melted and has actually deposited the wax through some of these other components. So that's one problem. The moment you see a wax capacitor like this, or these kind of style of capacitors, these are old. This was made in 1954. These look like the original capacitors. So these are, as of this date, over 60 years old. Over 60 years old. These capacitors are no longer acting as capacitors. They've broken down. They have broken down. We could test each one of these and find how much they are leaking, which is how capacitor breaks down. But I don't have that kind of equipment on me right here, and so we're just going to assume that every one of these capacitors is bad, and we're going to have to replace every single one. And that's going to be costly, and it's going to be a little tricky because these capacitors are of a certain value and a little bit harder to find these days. Now with the newer hobby maker movement, certain values of passive components are easier to find than others. These components are more RF and audio. They're a little bit more difficult to find. So we have to replace every single one of these, and then we can also test the resistors. Here's a resistor, and test those for their values. Now these resistors can be tested, and if they're good, we can keep them in place. Likely they're good. Resistors don't degrade significantly, not nearly as much as these capacitors would over time, and so they're probably okay. But we'll test them anyway. So that's the underside. This is what's called a transformer. This again is a coil, resistor, capacitor, and then here's the socket for the tube on top. Now as we look at the tubes, we have no way of telling if they are good or bad just by looking at them. There's one thing that we could tell by looking at it to see if they were bad, and that is if the vacuum had been lost. And here's the deal. I'm going to gently take out this tube, and every one of these, by the way, back in the day, these were called mini tubes. These are small tubes compared to the tubes that had been used, the first generation tubes. I have a radio over here that we may do as a restoration, and those have the older style, what are called standard. These are called the mini. Now you'll notice. Okay, when we look at the tube here, you'll see that you can see through it at this point, but then there's this little patch that's actually looks like a mirror. It's kind of mirrored. Sometimes that patch will be on the side like here, sometimes it'll be along the top, but that is not just a mirror. That's just what it looks like. It's actually a chemical. And what happens is that if you were to lose vacuum in the tube, that chemical would turn white with exposure to air. And so it's a very easy clear test. If you don't have a vacuum in a vacuum tube, it is not going to work at all. So that's a threshold, low-hanging fruit sort of test. If you see a white spot here, don't pass go, don't collect $200. This goes in the trash. Now I'm going to look at each one of these tubes, and just as I was looking at them before, they all looked fine. As we also look at this tube, this is very old and some of this is rubbed off. Let's see if we can find along the top here, usually they'll have the identifier, and there isn't one on this tube. I'm not seeing that. Let me find another tube here. So hold on just a second and I'll come back. All right, so here we are with another tube. You'll see the brand name, Sylvania, made in the USA. And then up here in gray, you can just see here the letters that are telling, and numbers that are telling you the type of tube it is. That's really important to know because that's how you test the tube. And if it goes bad, which tubes would go bad, that's how you would replace it. You get another 50. What is that? That's a C5 or G5. Hard for me to tell right here. I'll have to look that up a little closer. But that's the tube that we're going to take a look at. Now you'll notice the silver that we talked about is now on the top here. Again, if that was white, then this tube is just no good. We just throw it away. All right, so those are some tubes. Now I'm going to go and remove the tubes and the radio, and we will store those tubes. All right, here's what I'm showing you here. It's a close-up of the stationized dial panel, and you can see the letters of the stations that were in effect in the Western United States at that time. You can see KHJ here, KFI here, and you'll notice that contrary to the convention that we usually have, the higher frequency stations were here on the left and moved toward the right. As you'll know in any radio dial, usually it's the lower frequency that's in the right, on the left side here, moves towards the right. So that's the dial. I thought you'd be able to see it and to see that when it says that the radio is stationized, that's what it meant. Okay, so let's go on and continue with our project. All right, so now I had, you'll remember I had shown you this tube and it had not been marked. So what we're going to do is I'm going to go ahead and mark the tube and mark it according to what the tube layout here on the back says that it should be. So what this tube layout tells me that it should be is a 3, 5, W, 4. And I'm going to put little quote marks around that. We'll tentatively test this to make sure that it's up to specs to a 35W4 tube. But in the meantime, we're just going to kind of mark it so that we can know what it's claiming to be. Okay, so I'm going to put that in storage with the rest of the tubes. And I'm going to be pulling out with the one tube, and I'm going to be pulling out the rest of the tubes here. Now vacuum tubes of this era are pretty easy. They're just kind of pressed into the sockets. So you just take it and you kind of wiggle it a little bit, not too much or you'll bend the pins. Wiggle it a little bit back and forth, kind of like you're removing a tooth that's coming out from your, your 3-year-old child here. You just move it back and forth, pulls out, comes right out. And the same thing over here, very gently. And same thing over here. Now what I've already done is I've taken out the bulb here for the dial light. You can see it's just held on by a bracket to the speaker, and this is a bayonet type bulb. So what you do is you press in and turn it for it to pop out. All right, so we've removed the tubes and we'll go on to talk about what's next. Okay, so now that we removed the tubes and the bulb, the next step will be to disconnect kind of the other things here from the metal chassis. So it'll be a matter of disconnecting the speaker, unsoldering the leads, just unscrewing the dial here, making sure that the little light is off, And then the trickier part here will be the antenna assembly, which is this cardboard with this kind of fiber-coated wire that's acting as an insulator, which is the antenna, which is soldered here both to the tuner and down below to the chassis ground. And that'll be a little trickier, and then we'll remove all of that and be able to clean up the chassis just from the dirt and such, just to make it a little bit nicer. And at that point, we'll be ready to go on. In the meantime, like I said, we will be looking to replace all of these capacitors. It turns out that the capacitors are damaged, they are broken down, and if you turn the radio on, the bad capacitors can actually damage the tubes here and cause them to wear out a lot quicker, perhaps even cause them to burn out immediately. So I don't want to apply any electricity to the radio yet until these capacitors are all replaced. And that will take some, getting online and ordering them, determining what the values are, and then we'll, when I get all those parts in, then I will solder them in, show you how that's done, and we will go forward from there. But in the meantime, I have a little bit of cleanup to do here, and that's kind of the end of our first part. So if you liked it, give me a thumbs up or whatever it is the appropriate action is, and we appreciate your support, and see you next time.